everyone. Welcome to the Incubator Podcast. This is your co-host, Abir Saran.
And this is Darren Boyd. Today, we're going to continue our segment on observability, and we are super excited to have a little bit of a tech celebrity. We've got Morgan McLean in the house with us. Now, Morgan is director of product at Splunk. He focuses on Splunk Observability, but he's also part of OpenCensus. He was a co-founder of OpenCensus. He's a co-founder of OpenTelemetry. Two of, I think, the most pivotal and interesting CNCF projects, quite frankly. So we're super excited to have you, Morgan. And Morgan, before we get into any of the conversation, could we turn it over to you to give a little bit of an intro to you, a bit of your background, and then we'll get started?
Yeah, sure thing. So as you mentioned, my name is Morgan McLean. I'm a director of product management at Splunk. I work on Splunk Observability Cloud. So if you're familiar with Splunk, the product you probably know and love the last 10, 15 years, Splunk Observability is as a complement to what's now called Splunk Enterprise. And it is very focused on allowing developers and operators and other practitioners to gain insight into the services and infrastructure that they're running and how they can debug them when things go wrong. And so before I joined Splunk, I was at Google, and prior to that at Microsoft. At Microsoft, I worked on high-scale web services, so I got to understand the sort of end-user aspect of this space. And at Google, I was working at Google Cloud on other observability tools, and that's where we kicked off OpenCensus, and then we merged OpenCensus with another project called OpenTracing into OpenTelemetry, which is part of the reason I'm here.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for that, Morgan. So before we go too deep and get further ahead on this, would you mind helping our audience really understand a definition of what is observability and where or how has it evolved from what was the traditional monitoring mindset or logging mindset and things of that nature?
Yeah, there's a number of different ways to slice this. Fundamentally, observability is the ability to understand the state and status of your system so you can better develop it, so you can just get a better conceptualization for yourself of how it works, and so that if things go wrong, you can better trace those down and find out exactly what has gone wrong to reduce your mean time to resolution. I'm probably selling it short. I'm sure other people can offer even more eloquent answers to this, but it's to me like it's being able to see what it is you've built, and you can apply this observability concept to things other than just software and infrastructure, right? Like if you think of a large business that makes a lot of money and has to pay its staff and has other costs, they certainly have accountants and other people who are going and watching, their sales every day, every quarter and everything, or watching how their business, the health of their business. Observability is giving you the same sort of capabilities that I think are fundamentally required to run large web services or really software at any sense of scale. Into your services and your infrastructure. So you can see how they're doing, how they're built, how they interact, and it helps you solve issues. It also helps you develop it, because if you have 1,000 or so services in the wild and you want to go extend one of them to do something else, well, you better know how it interacts with the rest of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So building on that concept, so we're saying, there was metrics, there's logs, there's traceability, the end-to-end aspect of that comes together in what is observability. We often find, Morgan, is some of our brethren in enterprises have this view. If they were in traditional monitoring, they have the infrastructure monitoring view. And then you have now the evolution, call it DevOps, into product teams, application teams, which have been used to thinking about everything from a context of APM. Now observability collapses all of that together. Would you say that APM is dead because it's all replaced by this concept of observability?
I don't know if I'd say if it's dead, because APM itself is a bit of a loaded term, right? Sure. Because I certainly remember when I was at Google and I was started with distributed tracing, and then my portfolio expanded to debugging and profiling. And I remember then in 2016, 2017, looking around the so-called APM industry, and the offerings from each vendor were often fundamentally very different in what they provided. There would be some set of overlap, right? If you imagine a big Venn diagram, there'd be a small amount of overlap, but some would be very focused on code profiling for certain languages. And they wouldn't even do what now we consider to be standard, which is distributed tracing. There'd be others who would be very focused on application metrics. So I hesitate to say something like APM is dead, both because there are people who might take that very personally, but also just because APM itself, it's very nebulous and broad. But I would agree with your fundamental premise that you mentioned earlier, where you said observability is the mushing together of many sort of what used to be thought of as different disciplines, different things. Investigating application performance is one, right? Infrastructure monitoring is another. And there's other aspects as well that come into observability. But if you go buy an observability tool, right, like we have Splunk Observability Cloud, there are many others, fundamentally, probably the pitch you're going to get, and it's a fairly accurate one right now, is, yeah, it's the stuff you considered monitoring, the stuff you considered APM, and some other things all mushed into one. I think that sells short where observability, how it can help you and where it's growing, but if you're used to fairly basic use cases, it's not a terrible way to think, at least, about the products that are currently on the market.
Oh, so we'll avoid the word dead, but maybe injured, and you had a role to play in it.
Yeah.
So then could you now, so that's a great definition, and thank you for setting the stage. Can you talk a little bit about OpenTelemetry, how it fits into this greater context? Then we'll start getting into some of those details.
Yeah, so there's a challenge that a lot of end users have had, so like the actual practitioners in the space who are running services and running infrastructure, that they've had, that's also shared by all of the vendors in this space. You know, we're one, and there are many others. And that is actually getting data in so they can analyze it, right? Like in many ways, when you talk to people who work at vendors in this space, they think of fundamentally two things when it comes to not just observability, but even monitoring, APM, and others. They have a way of getting data in, and that's usually agents and SDKs and APIs and all of that. And then they have their actual analysis. And as an end user, you might think that the analysis part is by far the hardest. And I wish that were true. But it turns out that capturing data from someone's systems, particularly application data, is incredibly difficult. It's not rocket science to do it for like a single integration. So if you have a customer who's using like all Linux boxes, all of the same version, and they're using just Java with a single framework, it's true. It's not that hard to get like distributed traces and metrics out of that. But it turns out that in the industry, look, when you talk to any company of substantial size or multiple companies, that they use dozens, hundreds, thousands of different technologies. Well, for each of these, they want to be able to observe them, which means you need to be able to capture data from those different technologies. This might be different languages that they've written their own services in. This might be different applications that they've, like databases and things that they're running that are sort of prepackaged. This might be even within their own services, a variety of different web frameworks and RPC frameworks and everything else. And there's the number of permutations and combination of these is so vast that just building support for them is incredibly challenging. And so this is the problem that OpenTelemetry attacks. It's that there's this massive, almost seemingly infinite set of integrations that you need, either as an end user or as a vendor, in order to offer a complete observability solution. And there's far too many for any single business in this space to support. And even if you wind the clock back and look at the classic APM tools that you mentioned earlier, they often would target maybe a few languages. Like I remember one of the bigger vendors back in like 2016, 2017, they basically said, well, we support Java and .NET. And if you use any other language, we have nothing to sell you. Like we can't help you. And that's not a healthy place to be, because there's a lot more languages out there that are being used by various businesses. And if they need end-to-end observability, they need to have support for all of those. So OpenTelemetry comes in here by providing the components that end users and vendors need to actually collect this information. This breaks down all the way to low-level things like an actual concept of like, what is a metric? What is a trace? What metadata should have a trace have on it? What does the actual class or object look like in various languages? How should these be transmitted between different components, all the way to the very sort of end user facing parts where we have a collector agent that you can run that has a bazillion integrations in it that pulls in data from various sources. And we have various SDKs and language specific agents which will pull in data, application data from the services that you as an end user have written yourself. And OpenTelemetry is very focused on capturing this data and providing you with the API and configuration surfaces you need to generate more or to process it in any way you like. And then OpenTelemetry will transmit this data, or does transmit this data, to your backends of choice. One of those might be Splunk Observability Cloud. I work at Splunk, so I'm a bit biased. But there's dozens of others, right? You've got like Prometheus and Jaeger and Zipkin as sort of open source destinations for this data. You have support for like New Relic and Lightstep and Dynatrace and various other vendors. You have all the cloud vendors' own offerings in here as well. You can use OpenTelemetry to send this data in its standardized format to these destinations. And indeed, you can even send it to multiple at the same time. And so it's a great way to avoid vendor lock-in as an end user. It's a great way just to also extract this data from sources various vendors might not even support. But you can also do kind of unique things like use multiple vendors or multiple solutions at the same time if you'd like. if you have the budget for it or the time to go deploy the right open source solution, you can have different teams use different tools and still have each team have full end-to-end visibility across everything. You can also use OpenTelemetry to send data to maybe a vendor solution or open source backend for processing, but also go and stash it somewhere in some like cold storage layer for audit or offline analytics. And so it unlocks a lot of flexibility as an end user. It also makes you far less beholden to any kind of vendor because it works with all of their solutions. And historically, if you were migrating from one APM or monitoring solution to another, just ripping out and replacing the agents and SDKs would be extremely costly. With OpenTelemetry, it's basically a line of config. It's very, very simple and straightforward. So it unlocks capabilities for everyone. We've bounded the project just to really cover data collection. We don't do any kind of analytics in OpenTelemetry, so it's not an end-to-end solution like, say, Jaeger or Zipkin or Prometheus. It's just focused on the data collection. And that's because that makes it A, it just means we can focus on less things, but B, it means that the various vendors and end users and people participating in the community have all of their interests very aligned, which I think has worked out really well.
There's, excuse me, there's so much to unpack there because that is such a powerful set of statements. We see a lot in the field that folks they're now looking at OpenTelemetry. Now, we've seen folks at Netflix experimenting. We've seen Shopify. People are starting to really consume this. The hoping you can kind of walk us through this piece. Today, if we look, it's, OpenTelemetry is stable on metrics, it's stable on traces, and we're getting into the log space. And actually, I think Stanza was an interesting kind of donation.
Yeah,
and
happy to talk about that. Yeah.
Some really cool things. But can you help us with, to your point, enterprises have done some things. They've instrumented in various ways. They've integrated certain product sets. In many ways, this is this ultimate arbiter of getting a common language, but it still requires us to rip things out and redo in some manner. And we're not, I want to be careful how I say it, but because logs isn't there quite yet for the context propagation.
It's true, yeah.
How do people practically look at this and say, hey, I want to start getting more serious about OpenTelemetry? How do I incentivize people to re-instrument? How do I bridge metrics and traces with a logging solution that isn't there yet? And if you could walk us through some ideas.
It's a really good question. So I can shed some more light on give some more context about like the current status, and then we can talk about the solution.
Wonderful.
So you're correct. So OpenTelemetry tracing went GA like early last year. It's been GA for a long time. And it's probably the most heavily used part of the project. And it was our main focus when we started off, right? Like OpenCensus, one of the precursor projects, had tracing and metrics. OpenTracing was, true to its name, focused on tracing. And there was a lot less prior art for tracing APIs or SDKs or agents. And so that was the big focus of OpenTelemetry early on, was tracing, and we achieved that. Metrics was always a focus, not nearly as important of one, but from early on we knew we wanted to do metrics. And so once tracing was complete, then we turned our attention to metrics. And so the sort of the GA implementations of the metrics SDKs and things are really in their final release candidates right now. And there's a lot of people using them. So it's technically not GA, the spec is GA. Technically the metrics releases I think are not quite 1.0, but they're basically there. You can go use them right now. Really not much is going to change. And then as you mentioned, logs, which started off much later into OpenTelemetry's lifetime, is a bit further behind. And again, it started later, so of course it's going to release a bit later. So logs is not GA yet, maybe later this year. I don't know if we have an official timeline yet. I don't even think it's technically in beta. I will say though, like logs is already being used in production at a variety of places. It's for what it does, like the scope is reduced from what we want it to be long term, but for what it does, which is basic logging scenarios on VMs and containerized environments, it does quite well, and it's pretty performant. And so there are some organizations who are now just using OTel's native logging capabilities, which is that sort of Stanza contribution that came in from ObservIQ, who are using that in production very successfully. For organizations who are looking to adopt OpenTelemetry, but who are saying, hey, logs isn't 1.0, I don't want to rely on that, and fair enough. You can use it in conjunction with other things, right? So like certainly at Splunk, we have customers who are using the OpenTelemetry metrics and tracing components within the collector and within the SDKs and agents, alongside our universal forwarder for Splunk Enterprise, our customers for Splunk Observability who all use OpenTelemetry, are using it alongside FluentD to capture their logs. And like, you know, eventually we will, once OTel's native logging capabilities are GA, we'll swap that out. But we got them using FluentD for now, and they interop really, really well. We've made sure of that, and there were a lot of meetings early on between the OTel and FluentD communities to ensure that there's some level of collaboration and cooperation there. So you can definitely use it piecemeal. If you're an organization who's saying, hey, I want metrics, traces, and logs, and I want them all in the same thing, I mean, now's the time. You could probably go try out the whole thing in OpenTelemetry today. At the same time, like, I would not suggest just sitting and waiting and saying like, oh, I'll take a look at this when logs are added, because there's going to be more data types as time goes on, right? Like, I don't think we've had any conversations about this in the community around like profiles, but like, it's a natural sort of next step for the project for a next type of data. There's also some work going on to capture network data through eBPF. Like, there's always going to be more signals that are added to OpenTelemetry. Logs is a very prominent one. But if you're sitting on the fence just sort of waiting for the project to be done, nothing is ever complete. Nothing is ever done, right? And now is probably the best time that there ever has been to dive in.
So Morgan, just if we can double click into that. So if you have customers that are traditional Splunk enterprise, right, and they're contemplating getting to the cloud, everything. So observability is on the table here.
Yes.
Which end should they actually start on? Should they start on with instrumenting metrics, traces, and everything like that, or get the logging part straight? And if it's the logging end of things, and they're already a Splunk customer, you know, how do they kind of evolve that architecture? So is it bottoms up or top down?
Yeah, so and there's a couple of different scenarios here. So let's take like the case of like VMs or physical machines. So for those, if you're an existing Splunk customer, and I realize this is very like specific to Splunk, each vendor's gonna have their own story around this. But for an existing Splunk customer, they're gonna come in, they're already using the universal forwarder, right? That's how you capture data from VMs and physical machines today with Splunk Enterprise or Enterprise Cloud. And so if you want to adopt our observability solutions, then you would deploy OpenTelemetry. You deploy the collector on each host to capture system metrics and to capture metrics from prepackaged applications, databases, message queues, things like that. And then you would deploy the language-specific components, either SDKs that are linked to your code or the language agents that are referenced by the language runtimes to capture distributed traces and application metrics. And you would not turn on our sort of bundled FluentD-based logging agent because you've already got the universal forwarder there capturing logs. And the same advice would be true if a customer, like, again, just very specific to Splunk, but if a customer came in and wanted to adopt both Splunk packages, which we're seeing a lot of, then we would still tell them today, go use the universal forwarder for your logs, use OTel for everything else. That will change. The long-term ambition for us as a company is that everything for all Splunk products is OTel, right? Just to be very, very clear about that. But OTel logging, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's not quite done yet. It has some capabilities that it does very well, but it doesn't have the breadth of something like the universal forwarder or even FluentD. But over time, it will gain that breadth from our contributions and the contributions of everyone else in the community. And at that point, then we would be switching everything over to use OpenTelemetry.
So to build on that, Morgan, as you mentioned earlier, we talked about, hey, this is effectively avoiding vendor lock-in, and you're getting a standardized framework with OpenTelemetry across the gamut here. So if you're on the application teams or the product teams now, so potentially you don't want to instrument all the SDKs, you know, you'll take the standards, leverage the APIs, et cetera.
Yep.
But is there a real carrot involved to getting the product teams to adopt OpenTelemetry concepts, regardless of the vendor of choice that may exist out there?
I think there's several. So like the breadth of integrations of OpenTelemetry is already, like, certainly for us, and I imagine this is true of most other vendors, already exceeds what we had internally. Right, like, so like we at Splunk, we've had the UF, but for Splunk Observability, it was, you know, previously with SignalFX and Omnition, and they had their own instrumentation, and they had big teams working on this. And one of the carrots for our customers is like, well, if you switch to OTel, there's just way more technologies that you could not observe previously because we hadn't built integrations for them. That now you're going to get right away out of the box because you're using OpenTelemetry. Another carrot is, of course, you know, a lot of customers are very concerned about vendor lock-in, and so if you use OpenTelemetry, you have a really sort of elegant way of avoiding that. But the final one, and this is for the more sort of sophisticated, more advanced customers who have really they want to do more processing of their telemetry before it gets sent in, is OpenTelemetry is very flexible, right? Like you can use the SDKs to go define a bunch of custom metrics. You can interact with spans in your traces and add additional custom annotations to them, or create additional spans, or rename them, or do whatever you want. You can do a huge amount of processing within the OpenTelemetry collector on the data that is sent into it to go change its shape, to add additional standard annotations. We've had customers who've come in and they say, hey, we like the standard OTel annotations that you use within OTel. And we use the same, we're very OTel native in Observability Cloud, so we use the same ones in the product. But they say, hey, our whole company, for whatever reason, 10 years ago, we standardized on this set of tags and annotations on everything. Well, that's great. Like with a couple rules in the OTel collector, you can go generate those as well from your existing data that was being piped in. And so it has this huge amount of flexibility. Mm-hmm. And like it's enough like that, like if you look at who contributes to OpenTelemetry, yes, the vendors are the big ones there. Like Splunk is one of the bigger contributors. There's Google and Microsoft and Lightstep and a whole bunch of others. And that's great. There's also a surprisingly high number of end users who contribute directly to OpenTelemetry, right? And so I think you mentioned Shopify, for example, that they've got people who work like very, very deeply within OpenTelemetry. I think that the city of Montreal, interestingly, has like a bunch of developers who work on OpenTelemetry. And there's a number of other large end users, Etsy and others, who contribute real engineering time to OpenTelemetry because they already get so much value out of it. And to me, that speaks to like, yes, there's a variety of sort of carrots that I listed, but there's also just the evidence of like, look at all these organizations who don't have a vested interest in this industry. They're not here to make money out of the project, but they get so much value out of their own use of it that they're happy to commit engineering time to it.
Yeah, and I've seen, I think it's a little aged now, but I think once upon a time you shared some stats on some of the contributions and yep. How many folks. Do you have any updated stats? I haven't seen any recently. But
so if you Google CNCF dev stats, okay. You can view them live. There's this beautiful Prometheus dashboard that the CNCF maintains for every single CNCF project, including ours. So like last I checked, we've been for over a year, the second largest CNCF project by number of contributors, by number of contributions. And the only one bigger than us by that measure is Kubernetes, which of course is huge. So that's something we're really, really proud of is the community that we've built. But yeah, you can go through the stats. You can see like which companies are contributing and where they're contributing to. And I mean, Splunk ranks very prominently there.
Yeah, I definitely want to go back through it off camera. Go ahead.
I will say this, like the community, the companies involved don't like, we have this sort of agreement to not like literally rank each other, but like there's a lot of companies, like Splunk is one of them. There's a lot of other firms that do huge contributions to OpenTelemetry. And I think the openness of this project and the fact that it's not just some like vendor fest or like open core project where, you use it, but all the good parts are restricted behind an enterprise license. Something. It is not that. Like it is a totally open project and everyone is trying to make it as good as possible. That to me makes it like it gives me so much joy working with it.
Darren is an aspiring contributor here, so
I'm joining all the SIGs. I'm joining the working groups. One day I'll get to contributing.
You're welcome to. Yeah, we have SIG meetings for. We've got like SIG meetings for every language, every sort of major project going on, and they meet weekly. It's a very vibrant, active community.
Yeah, the end user working group next week, I'm going to be a part of for sure.
Oh, cool. I'll see you there.
Perfect. But I'll also say off camera, I was just mentioning to Morgan that what OpenTelemetry is promoted as a free and open source software community has been phenomenal, and it's and you're really a beacon for how I think projects should be run. So it's a huge congrats there. But then also, as we were talking about the collector, which as you said, it can make it vendor agnostic. You can obfuscate data. You can control sampling rates, et cetera, et cetera. Makes this a very compelling way for folks to introduce. And with such a large community behind it, I can see that as a carrot. I don't know what made me think of this, but I was looking at AWS's distribution on OpenTelemetry. And I am curious if you can, I don't know what you can share, but what are the cloud, the CSPs doing in this space? How are they differentiating maybe between their implementations? What kinds of information can you share on cloud adoption of OTel?
Yeah, so it's pretty big, and like I worked at a cloud vendor before, so I can actually speak very closely to this. And so certainly when I was at Google, and I believe this belief is shared at Amazon and Microsoft as well, we had a big interest in OpenTelemetry at Google. When I was at Google, we were one of the founders of it, along with Splunk and Lightstep and Microsoft and a number of other companies. And for the cloud vendors, it's interesting, right? Because like if you think of like Splunk or New Relic or Dynatrace, like there's a reason they're contributing engineers to this. It's pretty obvious. Like it gets them data. It makes their customer experience better. It's a very sensible, straightforward investment. For the cloud vendors, it's actually like multifaceted. Part of it is, yes, the cloud vendors do have their own observability tools that they offer, right? You've got like Amazon CloudWatch and Google Cloud Monitoring and Azure Monitor and various things that are associated with those. And those offerings are, they exist. People use them. They're not, certainly my sense is they're not as popular as a lot of the third-party ones. But certainly for the cloud vendors, it makes some amount of sense to invest in OTel just to benefit those businesses. The bigger reason that I observed when I was at Google, and this was a big part of our funding internally, was that the various service provider teams within the cloud service providers, so the people who provide at Google like Kubernetes or Spanner databases or what have you, one of their big concerns is allowing people to observe what's going on in their usage of those platforms. And so they can expose data server side, right? Like if you think of Cloud Spanner, for example, at Google was the big funder of OpenTelemetry for years. And so it's like a big, fancy, hosted, globally available SQL database. And so for Spanner, there's various things they could expose inside of like cloud monitoring for sort of like back-end traces and metrics that they had and logs that they had. But there's also a lot of interactions between the client code that you would use when accessing their database and the database. And in order to capture things from the client code, you need something like OpenTelemetry. You need some kind of standard to expose that to your users. And if you don't, you get a lot of situations where your users come in and say, hey, I think Spanner's broken. I'm filing a support ticket because it's not working. And in a large number of these cases, not all of them, right? Like cloud providers do go down. But like in a large number of these cases, it was often either user error or the customer was using the database in a way that isn't necessarily optimal, like they're not batching requests or things. And a lot of these, if they realized if the customer had better observability into what they were actually doing with the database, they would solve this themselves instantly. But because their observability was poor, their next turn was just customer support and saying like, hey, this database isn't meeting my expectations. I'm having a bad experience. I'm going to go host my own Postgres database or something. And so for the cloud vendors, a lot of their interest is in just making their cloud more observable, no matter what tool you use. Like they love it if you use theirs, but they're happy if you use like Splunk or New Relic or Datadog or something else. They're totally fine with that. And so a project like OpenTelemetry makes that very easy for them, where they can say, hey, we've exposed this to you using the instrumentation that we hope you're already using at this point. Finally, for the cloud vendors, these are huge. These are the biggest like sort of web service deployments in the world is like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and probably Facebook and a few others. And so a lot of their interest in OpenTelemetry as well is somewhat selfish in terms of they're just using it internally. And so like I worked at Microsoft long before OpenTelemetry was ever a vision of anyone. But from chatting with some of the Microsoft people who work on the project, a large portion of their interest is also, well, they use it to monitor their own services inside of the company. And I know Google uses it in a few places internally. I don't know about Amazon. But for them, there's at least those three factors, and there's probably more.
Great. Thanks for that, Morgan. Coming back to kind of the ecosystem and where we said this, that ultimately OpenTelemetry, again, so to speak, is vendor agnostic. So a standardization. So where does that leave all the players and the vendors? How is it purely the visualization layer now? And while I was maybe polarizing with the APM is dead, and by no means I was really denoting that, because that visualization, to your point, is very important for different use cases that they have. So how is the ecosystem, Splunk as an example, retaining market share? What is the focus? What is the value of using Splunk Observability Cloud and with OpenTelemetry? And how does that work in terms of your stickiness? And what's the real incentive or carrot for people to stick with one vendor or go to another? Or anything.
In some sense, it's exactly what you mentioned. I mean, obviously there's more to it than visualizations. There's analytics and visualizations and everything else the vendors provide. But yeah, I mean, OpenTelemetry, first off, just increases the breadth of data they can capture. But in the long run, I suppose it means that they don't have to invest nearly as much of a share of their engineering talent in developing agents and SDKs, because once OpenTelemetry is fully mature, if such a thing exists, because of course it's capturing data from an ever-expanding list of sources.
Sure.
But in theory, it means you can invest relatively more on your analytics and your visualizations than you had to in the past on agents. If anything, I would say most of the vendors, my sense is, view this as a very much positive thing, because they're typically, having now worked at two sort of organizations in the space, they're typically quite frustrated with the amount of time that they need to spend getting data in, and they want to build features and new things that their customers like based off of analyzing that data rather than just pulling into the system. And so for a lot of them, I think this is actually quite freeing, because you can now focus on the things that your customers actually care about. Because even if we go back, say, like 10 years, and you're a now, I guess, what we call like a legacy APM vendor, if you had customers come to you saying, like in that example I gave earlier, like, I use Python, can you do APM on my Python apps? Previously, they'd just have to say, basically, well, no, right? We can't do that. And so thus you don't gain that customer. And so I think OpenTelemetry is very liberating for participants in the space, because it, as a vendor, it means you can actually focus on the things that win deals and give your customers value, and the things that bring you joy to build. And it's lets you focus on that. It allows your customers to use something that's much more, they're sort of happier to use and more trusting of, so you can more easily sort of win their business. They're not suspicious that you're going to lock them into your, some agent that is going to be hard to remove. And finally, it just grows the market massively. Like APM was big, but it was never that big, if you know what I mean. Like it had a couple of vendors in it. Some large firms would use APM software, but it was generally not the market I think it could have been. And something like OpenTelemetry means that like every organization who actually builds and deploys web services can now benefit from observability in a way that they couldn't before. So they can get faster code pushes, better time, faster time to resolution when there are outages, which also means that the vendors in the space can be very successful, because there's a much larger potential customer base. So because of technologies like this.
I really like where you're going with that too, because you're right. The purpose of this is for us to release code in a more efficient way, be able to do impact MTTR. What do you say when we have multiple product teams now? Let's say we have a microservice architecture, and product team A is using product A for their front end, and product team B is using product B, et cetera. But there is a dependency in the context of a transaction that now we have to troubleshoot. This is now the realm of maybe AI ops, maybe just correlation engines. How do we start to stitch together when we have different front ends? So now we've standardized collection, we have different front ends, but I still need a cohesive view of a transaction. What are some of the leading thoughts, or where do you play Splunk particularly in that space?
It's a good question, right? And so you have many options if you're a customer in that space. Like if you've gone and deployed OpenTelemetry, you now have the end-to-end data that you need to track those transactions, right? Your sort of data sources that are now emitting to OpenTelemetry are now going to emit end-to-end traces, such that in your e-commerce, your microservice example, where one UI action over here triggers a service over here, which triggers two services over here and four over here, and so on. You can now track that. And so if you were previously using one tool per team, which is honestly, you're bang on. We see that in a lot of organizations. You now have a few options. One, probably the most common that we're seeing, is like, okay, now we're going to pick one tool for everything, and we're going to standardize on that. And that's certainly where you see like firms like Splunk with Observability Cloud, like we're focusing very much on its breadth, so we can be very successful there. So we have something for your everything from your backend service developers to your database architects to your front end developers who develop like mobile applications. We are going to be offering things that assist all of those different people and more. Another option, in theory, is you can just keep using your different tools for each of those teams, but each of those tools now has full end-to-end visibility. With paid offerings, that tends to be fairly expensive, particularly if you're paying by data ingestion, because you now have to ingest the data to all of them, so you're paying for them. But if you have the budget for it, you can now use OpenTelemetry to send data to all of those tools. And we certainly see some organizations do that during a period where they're, say, evaluating many different tools at the same time. So then they're going to pare down the list to a smaller set, mostly for budget reasons. But the scenario you gave is, it's bang on. Like I was just meeting with a very large e-commerce firm a few weeks ago, and it was literally what they described as like, here's the 12 different layers of our service architecture, and each one uses a different tool. It's common, it's everywhere, and OpenTelemetry, I think, makes that migration or even just staying in that state if you want to a lot easier.
So maybe this is self-serving for Splunk here, but if an organization had started out with Splunk as their SIEM, enterprise security, the whole ITSI landscape, arguably it makes sense to continue down the path unless you have a significant budget to entertain a suite of different other tool sets out there to lift and shift. And maybe just taking that one step further, Morgan, would you advise then it is better to rationalize on a provider, albeit maybe some of the traditional APM players or legacy ones that you may not been good at collecting logs, as an example, where I think Splunk would have an edge. So that one environment would lead to a disparate tool set. So I guess what I'm saying is,
I mean, you can live with the disparate tool set,
provided you're willing to pay for it.
Is like, yes, there are offerings in the market. Splunk Observability Cloud plus Splunk Enterprise being one of them. There are certainly others. I mean, like vendors like Datadog have a lot of breadth as well. Like, just to be clear, but like there are offerings that are very comprehensive, that are taking advantage of this. And as a user, assuming that these offerings are providing the things you want, it's very nice because in addition to seeing end-to-end transactions, you also get to take advantage of the data relationships. And like, to be clear, even at Splunk, like this is something we're just scratching the surface of, but I think it's something we're already doing a fairly decent job of. And this is integrating like even within our observability tool, if you're looking at a given service in our application focused view, with one button click, you can now view, or even in context, you can view all of the infrastructure that backs that service and see its performance. And you can also see the logs that were generated from it. And if you click if you're looking at a given trace, you can see all the logs that occurred across your entire service stack for that trace, and so on and so forth. And so like there are definitely benefits to landing on a single suite. I don't want to totally sound like I'm shutting down other options. There are some specialty tools that are really good at what they do. And part of the power of OpenTelemetry is you can have, in theory, the benefits of both, where you can have a suite like Splunk, like Splunk's various offerings, for example, or the others who participate in OpenTelemetry, that provides like huge, broad capabilities to all of your teams. But if you have a team who says like, you know what, this really isn't doing it for us, we need very specific like database analytics, or we need very specific like real-time user monitoring capabilities or something. Well, in a lot of these situations today, and in more of them in the future, OpenTelemetry is going to capture that data. So all you have to do is send it to the two different places. And so you can really take advantage of either path you want to go. You can choose the tools that suit you best, that align with your budget as well.
Yeah, so suffice to say, OpenTelemetry brings down the barriers of using disparate tool sets, provided you're willing to pay for it.
Of course,
And then arguably, hey, that end-to-end picture and visualization and observability may be best provided at an 80% Pareto principle by one tool set. Of course, there's the outlier use cases. Use whatever technology fits your.
And it really lets you pick and choose. And again, like the benefit of the one with OpenTelemetry is you can get those really nice correlations between the different parts of the tool set, right? So like with Splunk today, and this is the thing I hadn't mentioned earlier, like if you're using Splunk Enterprise and Splunk Observability Cloud, which still on the back end are relatively separate products, right? That's where we're doing a lot of work to bring those together, but they're still somewhat separate. But as a user, it doesn't necessarily matter because we can pull in the logs that are captured from Splunk Enterprise into Splunk Observability Cloud. And as long as you have a few pieces of metadata that the universal forwarder is capturing, and we have documentation on this that gives it the metadata it needs to align with everything from OpenTelemetry, we can now let you jump between those logs, even though they're captured in a totally different way in a different tool. We can allow you to jump back and forth between those logs and the various services that generated them, the pieces of infrastructure that generated them, the traces that they're correlated with, so on and so forth. And we can provide that really integrated experience. And so even between somewhat disparate tools, granted these are ones owned by the same company, you can already start to form these really powerful bridges for customers because that constant metadata is there. And so if you use a single integrated suite, there's a lot, even more you can do. Yeah. So it really just provides a ton of flexibility, which is great.
Yeah, you said something earlier too when we first opened and you were describing observability. One of the things you said is it can help you conceptualize your application, and I think that's interesting because we're seeing, this is maybe a little bit of futures. We're seeing obviously observability, OpenTelemetry take a greater role in things like trace-based testing.
Yep.
Right, we saw it with Malabi and open source. We're seeing it as a part of the CI/CD process. So you can see pre, during, post-release, et cetera, see where there's regressions, et cetera. where else are you leaning forward with OpenTelemetry? What are you working on next? If you could do maybe a little bit of futures, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, sure.
On OpenTelemetry.
Yeah. I mean, it's all open source, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, the most immediate things for the community, I think, are finishing the metrics GA, getting the actual 1.0 releases out there. That's just around the corner, though. Like by the time this podcast goes to air, that might be done. After that is finishing up on logs. It will be the next big focus, though. We've had a lot of traction there, a lot of people working on it the last 6 months especially. So I think we're gonna have pretty good progress there. Then I think about sort of the new frontiers, the things that we haven't really explored yet. One that has been starting has been eBPF, so Extended Berkeley Packet Filter, using that to capture data. So there's a donation, coincidentally from Splunk, though it's not a thing I worked on a whole lot directly, that uses eBPF to capture network telemetry. So you can build a nice network map and things. And there's folks from Amazon and Datadog and New Relic also participating in that. And so that's potentially an interesting one. A lot of people have mentioned profiling as another signal type. So using OpenTelemetry to delve all the way down from service to service dependencies to actual code function calls. And certainly distributed profiling through the work of firms like Google and other firms in the last 4 or 5 years has become a thing that's much more common. And so OpenTelemetry could give you this profile information, this sort of function-to-function, both dependency and performance information from inside of your code and how it's running in production, and correlate that with infrastructure performance and traces and service performance and everything else. And so that to me is very powerful. But fundamentally, to me, it can go on a bit of a tangent, but the reason I got into this space was because I took a job at Google to work on distributed tracing. And the reason I took that job is because I was working at Microsoft on big, mealy, very, very high scale backend services. And I was one of the N small group of people who could actually draw out the dependencies between this set of services on any given week while they were changing all the time. And this was in Microsoft's e-commerce platform. And I wanted to work on distributed tracing because I realized how fragile it was to have a small set of people who you had to drag into every meeting, every week, every time anything changed to describe to sort of set the basis for everybody about how all these different services actually interact. And so already with tracing and metrics and logs, we will have achieved that vision, that thing that made me pursue that job and made me pursue my current career at Splunk and made me pursue this project. But I am excited to see how that relates, how we can then bring that all the way into code performance and, to your point, into analyzing things through across different versions, integrating that into CI/CD software, so you can actually do tests and automatically compare the performance of different production versions all the way down to single lines of code and actually find regressions there. That's where I see things going in the open source space, at least, in terms of data collection. It's just going to be more breadth and more depth in terms of the types of data and different sources we capture data from.
And if anybody's looking for information on OpenTelemetry, is it best to just go to the website, OpenTelemetry.io? Yep. Is that?
There's 3 great places. So if you're interested in just using it, you want to kick the tires, OpenTelemetry.io is by far the best place to go. If you're interested in learning more about the community, then certainly OpenTelemetry.io is a great place to start. But I recommend either joining our Slack community, that we're on the CNCF Slack instance along with most other CNCF projects under the OpenTelemetry channel, and joining our weekly special interest group meetings, of which there are several. So if there's a certain topic you're interested in, like Java development, we have one for that. They meet every week. Or if you're interested in just general specification issues or anything else, the weekly special interest group meetings are the best place to go.
All right, perfect.
Awesome. Morgan, it's been a true pleasure to have you on Incubator Podcast today. I want to thank you for your time. This has been very informative and really enlightening for us. We hope our audience sees it the same way. And again, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Happy to be here. And if you're interested in chatting with anyone else in the OpenTelemetry community, I'm happy to make an introduction.
Love that. Would love that. Thank you so much, Morgan. We'll see you on that working group.
Yeah, perfect. See you there.